Maria Santos had always believed in doing the right thing, even when nobody was watching. For 15 years, she worked as a senior accountant at Pinnacle Defense Solutions, one of the largest government contractors in the country. Her small office on the third floor overlooked the parking lot, and every morning at exactly 7:30 a.m., she would arrive with her thermos of black coffee and her worn leather briefcase. Maria wasn't the type of person who stood out in a crowd. At 42, she wore simple blouses and practical shoes, kept her graying hair in a neat bun, and spoke only when necessary during meetings. Her colleagues often forgot she was in the room, which suited her perfectly fine. She preferred numbers to people anyway. Numbers didn't lie, didn't play politics, and didn't break promises. The company specialized in military equipment contracts worth billions of dollars. Maria's job was to track expenses, verify invoices, and ensure every penny was accounted for. She took pride in her work, knowing that her careful attention to detail helped support the brave men and women serving their country overseas. But something had been bothering Maria for months. Small discrepancies in the books that didn't add up, invoice numbers that appeared twice, payments to suppliers that didn't seem to exist. At first, she assumed these were simple clerical errors. After all, with contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, mistakes were bound to happen. However, as Maria dug deeper, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Money was disappearing, not in small amounts, but in massive chunks that would make anyone's head spin. Equipment that was supposedly shipped to military bases overseas had no delivery confirmations. Suppliers were being paid for goods that were never manufactured. The more she investigated, the more her stomach churned. Late one evening, as the office building emptied and the cleaning crew began their rounds, Maria sat at her desk staring at spreadsheets that told a horrifying story. Pinnacle Defense Solutions wasn't just overcharging the government. They were stealing from it on a scale that defied imagination. Fake companies, phantom shipments, and completely fabricated expenses had been siphoning taxpayer money for years. The worst part was realizing who was involved. Her boss, Richard Blackstone, whose family photos smiled down from his corner office. The friendly HR director who always remembered everyone's birthday. Even the CEO who gave inspiring speeches about supporting the troops during company meetings. They were all part of it. Maria's hands trembled as she printed document after document, her small desk printer working overtime in the quiet office. She organized everything into folders, cross-referenced bank statements with shipping records, and traced the money trail that led to offshore accounts in countries she'd never heard of. She knew she had to report this, but to whom? The company's board of directors was likely involved. The local police wouldn't understand financial documents this complex. The FBI seemed too intimidating for a quiet woman who had never even gotten a speeding ticket. That's when Maria remembered reading about congressional oversight committees. Surely the senators who approved these massive defense budgets would want to know if their money was being stolen. She spent hours researching which committee handled defense appropriations and found their public hearing schedule online. The next morning, Maria called in sick for the first time in 3 years. She sat in her small apartment kitchen staring at the phone book, trying to find the courage to call the Senate Defense Appropriations Committee. Her hands shook as she dialed the number, and when a stern-voiced assistant answered, Maria's voice barely came out as a whisper. "I have information about defense contractor fraud," she managed to say. "I think the senators need to know." The assistant sounded bored, like she received calls from crazy people every day. She took Maria's name and number with obvious reluctance and said someone might call back. Maria hung up feeling foolish and small, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. But 3 days later, her phone rang. A serious-sounding man introduced himself as chief counsel for the committee and asked if Maria could appear at a hearing the following week. The blood drained from her face as she realized there was no going back now. Maria had never been inside a government building bigger than the post office. The idea of sitting before a panel of powerful senators with cameras rolling and reporters taking notes made her feel physically ill. But every time she wavered, she thought about the soldiers overseas who weren't getting the equipment they needed because the money meant to protect them was lining someone else's pockets. She requested vacation time from work, telling her supervisor she needed to visit a sick relative. The lie felt heavy on her conscience, but she couldn't risk Blackstone and his associates learning what she was planning to do. The weekend before the hearing, Maria sat in her living room practicing what she would say. She had prepared a simple statement explaining what she'd discovered, backed up by dozens of documents she'd secretly copied. She rehearsed in front of her bathroom mirror, trying to keep her voice steady and her hands from shaking. Sunday night, she barely slept. Maria knew that once she testified before Congress, her quiet life would be over forever. There would be no going back to her small office, her routine, her anonymity. But as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she kept thinking about all the soldiers who were counting on people like her to do the right thing. The next morning, Maria put on her best navy blue suit, packed her briefcase with carefully organized evidence, and took the metro to Capitol Hill. She had no idea that her testimony would set in motion events that would ultimately bring down one of the most powerful defense contractors in the country and send shockwaves through the highest levels of government. The Hart Senate office building felt like a marble fortress to Maria as she walked through its imposing hallways. Her heels clicked nervously on the polished floor, echoing off the high ceilings decorated with ornate moldings and historical paintings. Security guards watched her with suspicious eyes as she clutched her briefcase tighter, feeling completely out of place among the well-dressed lobbyists and confident-looking staffers who moved through the building like they owned it. The hearing room was smaller than she'd expected, but no less intimidating. 5 senators sat behind a curved mahogany desk on a raised platform, looking down at the witness table where Maria would soon be sitting. The room buzzed with quiet conversations between journalists, congressional staff, and a few people in expensive suits whom Maria didn't recognize but who seemed very interested in her presence. Senator Harold Whitman, the committee chairman, was a silver-haired man in his 60s who had been in Congress for over 20 years. His reputation for being tough on witnesses was legendary, and Maria could feel his cold blue eyes sizing her up as she took her seat at the witness table. To his right sat Senator Patricia Fleming, a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine despite being in her 50s. The other senators seemed less interested, shuffling papers and whispering to their aides. "State your name for the record," Senator Whitman said in a voice that carried the authority of decades in power. His tone suggested he already considered this hearing a waste of his valuable time. "Maria Santos," she replied, her voice barely audible through the microphone. A technician gestured for her to speak louder, which only made her more nervous. "Ms. Santos," Senator Fleming interrupted before Maria could continue. "I've reviewed your personnel file from Pinnacle Defense Solutions. You're an accountant with no law enforcement background, no investigative training, and no advanced degrees. What makes you think you're qualified to make accusations against one of our most important defense contractors?" Maria felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She hadn't expected them to attack her credentials before she'd even presented her evidence. I know numbers, Senator. I've been doing this work for 15 years and I know when something isn't right." Senator James Morrison, a younger man who seemed more interested in his phone than the hearing, looked up briefly. "Ms. Santos, are you aware that Pinnacle Defense Solutions employs over 50,000 people and contributes billions to our economy? Are you really suggesting that we should damage such an important company based on your interpretation of some accounting records?" The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Maria opened her briefcase and pulled out her carefully organized folders. "Senators, if you would just look at these documents, I can show you exactly what I found. There are payments to companies that don't exist. Shipping records for equipment that was never manufactured." "Ms. Santos," Senator Whitman cut her off, his voice rising slightly. "Do you have any idea how many conspiracy theorists and disgruntled employees come before this committee every year with similar claims? Do you think we don't already have oversight procedures in place to prevent the kind of fraud you're alleging?" Maria's hands began to shake as she realized this wasn't going the way she'd hoped. The senators weren't interested in her evidence. They seemed determined to dismiss her before she could even present it. "But if you would just examine the bank records, Senator Fleming laughed, a sound that echoed coldly through the room. "Mrs. Santos, do you have a court order to access these bank records? Did you obtain this information legally? Or are we dealing with theft of company property here?" The question hit Maria like a physical blow. She had copied the documents from her company's files, which she had legal access to as part of her job. But the way Senator Fleming phrased the question made it sound like Maria was some kind of criminal. "I had access to these files as part of my work duties." "Your work duties," Senator Morrison said with a smirk. which presumably don't include launching amateur investigations into your employer's business practices. Ms. Santos, this sounds like a disgruntled employee trying to cause trouble for a company that probably had very good reasons to question her work performance. Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes, which only made her more frustrated with herself. That's not true. My performance reviews have always been excellent. I'm only here because I care about our military and our tax dollars, Ms. Santos, Senator Whitman said with exaggerated patience, as if he were speaking to a slow child. Let me explain something to you. Defense contracting is extremely complex. These are multi-billion-dollar operations involving classified information, sophisticated supply chains, and technical specifications that would be beyond the understanding of someone in your position. What might look irregular to an accountant could be perfectly legitimate business practices that serve important national security purposes. The other senators nodded in agreement, and Maria could see the journalists in the room exchanging glances and shaking their heads. She was being painted as a confused woman who didn't understand the complexities of the world she was trying to expose. Furthermore, Senator Fleming added, I find it deeply troubling that you would come before this committee and attempt to damage the reputation of a company that provides essential services to our brave men and women in uniform. Pinnacle Defense Solutions has contracts to supply protective equipment, communication systems, and medical supplies to our troops. By making these baseless accusations, you're potentially undermining confidence in systems that keep our soldiers safe. Maria felt like the room was spinning. How had they turned her attempt to protect soldiers into an attack on them? But senators, that's exactly why this matters. If the money isn't going where it's supposed to go, then our soldiers aren't getting what they need, Ms. Santos, Senator Whitman said firmly, holding up his hand to silence her. I think we've heard enough. Your concerns have been noted, and I assure you that this committee takes all allegations seriously. However, we cannot allow unsubstantiated claims to damage the reputation of companies that are vital to our national defense. Maria realized with growing horror that they were dismissing her without even looking at her evidence. The folders full of documents that had kept her awake for months, the careful analysis that showed exactly how the money was being stolen, none of it mattered to them. Will you at least look at the documents? She pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. Ms. Santos, Senator Fleming said coldly, this committee has access to the same information you do, plus classified details that you don't. If there were any real problems with Pinnacle's contracts, we would already know about it. I suggest you focus on your accounting duties and leave oversight to the people who are qualified to handle it. As Maria gathered her ignored folders and prepared to leave, she could hear the whispered comments from the audience behind her. Words like waste of time, delusional, and attention seeker reached her ears. The journalists were already packing up their equipment, having decided this wasn't worth reporting on. Walking out of that hearing room was the longest walk of Maria's life. Her face burned with humiliation, and her hands shook as she carried her briefcase full of evidence that no one wanted to see. She had expected skepticism, maybe even some tough questions, but she hadn't prepared for such complete dismissal and personal attack. As she stood on the steps of the Capitol building, watching important-looking people hurry past her, Maria felt smaller than she ever had in her life. The senators had made her feel like a foolish woman who didn't understand the world she was trying to navigate. But as the initial shock of humiliation began to fade, something else began to grow in its place. A quiet, determined anger that would soon change everything. Maria returned to work the next day as if nothing had happened, but everything felt different. The familiar office building that had been her second home for 15 years now felt like enemy territory. She noticed how Richard Blackstone's assistant looked at her strangely when she passed in the hallway, and she wondered if somehow word of her testimony had already gotten back to the company. Her suspicions were confirmed that afternoon when Blackstone called her into his office. His usually friendly demeanor was replaced by something cold and calculating as he closed the door behind her and gestured for her to sit in the chair across from his massive oak desk. "Maria," he said, settling into his leather chair with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I understand you've been having some concerns about our accounting practices." Her blood turned to ice. There was no way he should know about her testimony unless someone had told him. The hearing had been public, but it hadn't been covered by the news. and she hadn't mentioned it to anyone at work. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Blackstone," she said carefully, though her voice betrayed her nervousness. "Let's not play games," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "Senator Whitman's office called me yesterday evening. They wanted to let me know that one of our employees had made some very serious accusations against the company. Accusations that could damage our relationships with important clients." Maria felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. The senators who had dismissed her so publicly had immediately called her boss to report her testimony. She realized now that the hearing had been nothing but a show. They'd never had any intention of investigating her claims. The senators were very complimentary about how professionally we've always handled our contracts. Blackstone continued, studying her reaction carefully. "They assured me that they have complete confidence in Pinnacle's operations and that they consider your concerns to be unfounded." The way he said the word unfounded made it clear that he knew exactly what she had discovered and that he wasn't worried about it at all. Maria felt a chill run down her spine as she realized how naive she had been to think the system would protect someone like her against people like him. "Now, Maria," Blackstone said, his voice taking on a false friendliness, "I want you to know that I understand why an accountant might become confused by the complexity of defense contracting. These operations involve classified elements that someone at your level wouldn't have access to or understand. I'm not angry about your misunderstanding." Maria said nothing, but inside she was seething. He was using the same condescending tone the senators had used, treating her like a confused child who couldn't comprehend the adult world around her. "However," he continued, and now his voice hardened, "I am concerned about your decision to take internal company documents to a congressional hearing without proper authorization. That raises some serious questions about your judgment and your loyalty to Pinnacle." "Those documents showed," Maria began, but he cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Those documents showed accounting entries that you didn't understand, taken out of context by someone without the proper clearance or background to interpret them correctly." His eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, but more importantly, Maria, they were proprietary company information that you had no right to share with outsiders. Maria felt her anger building, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I had access to those documents as part of my job duties. You had access to review them for your assigned tasks," Blackstone corrected, "not to copy them and distribute them to government officials. That's a violation of your employment agreement and potentially a criminal act." The threat was unmistakable. Maria realized that while she had been trying to expose wrongdoing, she had also put herself in a vulnerable position. By taking the documents outside the company, she had given them ammunition to use against her. "Now," Blackstone continued, his voice becoming more businesslike, "I'm prepared to overlook this incident. We'll call it a learning experience, but I'm going to need your assurance that nothing like this will happen again. And I'm going to need you to sign a statement, acknowledging that your concerns were based on misunderstandings and that you have no reason to believe Pinnacle has engaged in any improper activities." Maria stared at him in disbelief. He was asking her to lie, to sign a document that would contradict everything she knew to be true. "Mr. Blackstone, I can't sign something that isn't true." His friendly mask slipped completely then, revealing something ugly underneath. "Maria, let me be very clear about your situation. You're a 42-year-old accountant with 15 years at one company. Your skills are adequate but not exceptional. If you were to lose your job here, finding comparable employment would be challenging, especially if potential employers learned about your tendency to make unfounded accusations against your employers." The threat was crystal clear. Sign the statement and keep quiet, or lose her job and find herself blacklisted in her industry. Maria had no savings to speak of, no wealthy family to fall back on, and no other obvious career options. At her age, starting over would be nearly impossible. "I need time to think about this," she said, standing up on unsteady legs. "Of course," Blackstone said, his fake smile returning. "Take the evening to consider your options. We can discuss your decision in the morning." That night, Maria sat in her small apartment staring at the walls and feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. The senators had humiliated her and then betrayed her confidence to her boss. Her employer was threatening to destroy her career if she didn't lie about what she had discovered. The system she had believed in, The idea that doing the right thing would be rewarded had completely failed her. She thought about signing Blackstone's statement. It would be so easy to go back to her quiet life, her routine, her anonymity. She could pretend she had never seen those documents, never traced that money, never discovered the massive fraud that was stealing from taxpayers and potentially putting soldiers at risk. But as she sat there in the darkness, Maria found herself thinking about her father, a man who had worked 2 jobs to support his family, and had always taught her that integrity was the most important thing a person could have. Once you compromise your principles for convenience, he used to say, you'll find it gets easier and easier until you don't have any principles left. She thought about the soldiers overseas who were counting on the equipment that Pinnacle was supposed to be providing but wasn't. She thought about the billions of taxpayer dollars that were disappearing into offshore accounts while schools went underfunded and infrastructure crumbled. But most of all, she thought about the way the senators had treated her, not just dismissing her concerns, but actively humiliating her for having the audacity to speak up at all. They had made it clear that people like her were supposed to stay quiet and let their betters handle the important decisions. By morning, Maria had made her choice. She walked into Blackstone's office and told him she wouldn't be signing his statement. His face darkened immediately, and within an hour, security was escorting her out of the building with a box containing 15 years' worth of personal items from her desk. As she stood in the parking lot, watching the building where she had spent most of her adult working life, Maria felt a strange sense of freedom mixed with terror. She had lost her job, her security, and probably her future, but she hadn't lost her integrity. What she didn't know yet was that losing everything she thought she valued would ultimately give her the freedom to do something that would shake the foundations of power in ways she never could have imagined. Being unemployed gave Maria something she hadn't had in years: time. While she worried about her dwindling savings and sent out resume after resume with no responses, she also found herself with entire days to think about what she had discovered at Pinnacle. The more time passed, the more convinced she became that the fraud was even bigger than she had initially realized. 3 weeks after losing her job, Maria was sitting in a coffee shop downtown when she noticed a young woman at a nearby table crying quietly while staring at her laptop screen. Something about the woman's distress reminded Maria of how she had felt during those dark days at Pinnacle, so she approached carefully. "I'm sorry to bother you," Maria said gently, "but you look upset. Is everything okay?" The woman looked up with red-rimmed eyes. She was probably in her late 20s, with short black hair and the kind of pale complexion that suggested she spent most of her time indoors. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disturb anyone. I'm having a really hard time at work. Would you like to talk about it?" Maria asked, settling into the adjacent chair. Sometimes it helps to tell a stranger. The woman introduced herself as Jessica Chen, a junior programmer at a government IT contractor called Data Flow Systems. As she told her story, Maria felt a familiar chill of recognition. Jessica had been assigned to work on a project involving data management for military supply chains. But the more she dug into the code, the more she realized that the system wasn't tracking supplies at all. It was hiding them. "The program I'm supposed to be maintaining," Jessica explained, wiping her eyes with a napkin. "It's designed to make fake entries in supply databases. It can create records for equipment that doesn't exist, generate false shipping confirmations, even produce fake inspection reports. When I asked my supervisor about it, he told me it was for testing purposes. But Maria, I've been programming for 8 years. This isn't testing software. This is fraud software." Maria's heart began racing as she realized that Jessica had stumbled onto the technical side of what she had discovered in the financial records at Pinnacle. The 2 companies were working together, using sophisticated software to create the fake paper trail that made the stolen money look legitimate. "Have you reported this to anyone?" Maria asked. Jessica laughed bitterly. "Who would I report it to? My company has contracts with half the defense contractors in the country. The people who would investigate this are probably the same people who approved the contracts in the first place." That's when Maria told Jessica about her own experience, the discovery at Pinnacle, the humiliating congressional hearing, and the retaliation that had cost her job. As she spoke, she watched Jessica's expression change from despair to anger to determination. "We need to do something," Jessica said quietly. "This isn't just about money. People are dying because they're not getting the equipment they need. Over the following weeks, Maria and Jessica began meeting regularly, sharing information and piecing together the scope of the fraud network. Jessica used her programming skills to trace data flows and identify other companies that might be involved, while Maria analyzed the financial patterns that connected various defense contractors. What they discovered was staggering. The fraud wasn't limited to Pinnacle Defense Solutions. It was a coordinated effort involving dozens of companies, government officials, and congressional representatives. The software that Jessica had been working on was being used to create false records across the entire defense supply chain, allowing companies to bill for billions of dollars worth of equipment that was never manufactured, shipped, or delivered. Through careful research, they identified a network of shell companies with addresses that turned out to be vacant lots or closed businesses. Bank records that Jessica had accessed through her work system showed money flowing from government contracts to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and other tax havens. But the most shocking discovery came when Jessica managed to access the communications logs for her company's internal messaging system. She found emails between data flow executives and officials from other defense contractors, discussing how to coordinate their billing to avoid triggering automatic fraud detection systems. The messages revealed a level of sophistication and planning that made it clear this wasn't opportunistic fraud, it was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy. Even more disturbing were the references to congressional supporters who were being kept informed of the operation and receiving their own financial benefits in return for their protection. The same senators who had humiliated Maria in that hearing were mentioned by name as key allies who would ensure that any investigations were quashed before they could cause problems. As the evidence mounted, Maria and Jessica realized they were uncovering something much bigger than corporate fraud. They were exposing a systematic corruption of the defense contracting process that reached into the highest levels of government. But they also knew that the people they were investigating had already demonstrated their willingness and ability to destroy anyone who threatened them. "We need help," Maria said during one of their late-night research sessions in Jessica's apartment. "This is too big for just the two of us." Jessica had been thinking the same thing, but she had an idea that Maria hadn't considered. Through her work in IT, she had become connected to a loose network of other programmers and data analysts who worked on government contracts. Many of them had noticed irregularities in their own systems but had been afraid to speak up for fear of losing their jobs. "What if we're not alone?" Jessica asked. "What if there are other people out there who have seen pieces of this and just need someone to help them put it all together?" They began reaching out carefully, using encrypted communication tools that Jessica's technical background allowed her to set up. One by one, they found other employees at defense contractors who had noticed things that didn't add up. An engineer who had been asked to sign off on inspections for equipment he had never seen. A logistics coordinator who had shipped empty containers to overseas bases. An accountant who had been told to process payments to companies that couldn't be reached by phone. Each person they contacted added another piece to the puzzle, revealing the true scope of a fraud network that had been operating for years and stealing billions of dollars from American taxpayers. But as their informal investigation grew larger, so did the risks they were taking. Maria knew that the people they were investigating had already shown they were willing to use intimidation, job loss, and public humiliation to silence whistleblowers. If they discovered the growing network of employees who were comparing notes and sharing information, the retaliation would be swift and severe. But Jessica had been working on something that might level the playing field, a comprehensive database that organized all the evidence. They had gathered into an undeniable pattern of fraud and corruption. She had learned from Maria's experience that individual testimonies could be dismissed and discredited, but she believed that the right presentation of data might be impossible to ignore. Late one night, as they worked in Jessica's apartment surrounded by printouts and laptops, Jessica held up a small electronic device that looked like an ordinary USB flash drive. "This contains everything," she said. "Financial records, email communications, software documentation, bank transfers, shell company registrations, all of it. Organized and cross-referenced to show exactly how the money flows and who's involved." Maria stared at the innocent-looking device that contained enough evidence to bring down some of the most powerful people in Washington. "What do we do with it?" Jessica smiled grimly. We figure out how to make sure the right people see it and can't ignore it or cover it up this time. Neither of them knew it yet. But that small flash drive would soon become the most dangerous piece of evidence in Washington, and the people who possessed it would find themselves at the center of the biggest political scandal in decades. Maria and Jessica spent weeks debating how to use the evidence they had compiled. They couldn't go back to the same congressional committee that had humiliated Maria. Those senators were clearly part of the problem. Traditional media seemed risky because stories could be buried or discredited before they gained traction. Law enforcement agencies might be compromised by the same political connections that protected the fraud network. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. During one of their research sessions, Jessica discovered that Senator Elizabeth Warren's office had recently launched an investigation into defense contractor oversight following complaints from military families about substandard equipment. Unlike the senators who had dismissed Maria, Warren had a reputation for taking on powerful interests and wasn't known to have close ties to defense contractors. But rather than approaching Warren directly, Jessica had a more strategic idea. She had noticed that Warren's investigation was being covered by Sarah Mitchell, an investigative journalist at the Washington Post who specialized in government corruption stories. Mitchell had a reputation for thorough reporting and had broken several major stories about contractor fraud in the past. If we can get the evidence to the right journalist, Jessica explained, she can verify it independently and publish it in a way that makes it impossible to ignore or suppress. They spent days crafting an approach that would protect their identities while ensuring the evidence reached Mitchell. Jessica used her technical skills to create an anonymous communication channel, and they prepared a comprehensive package that not only contained the flash drive but also included a detailed explanation of how they had discovered the information and what it revealed. The package they sent to Mitchell was devastating in its thoroughness. It contained financial records showing exactly how billions of dollars had been stolen through fake contracts and shell companies. Email communications revealed the coordination between different defense contractors and their congressional allies. Software documentation proved that systems had been deliberately designed to hide fraud. Bank records traced the money from government payments to offshore accounts controlled by the conspirators. Most importantly, the evidence showed that the same senators who had dismissed Maria's testimony, Whitman, Fleming, and Morrison, had received substantial financial benefits from the companies they were protecting. Campaign contributions, speaking fees, and consulting contracts for family members had flowed from Pinnacle, Defense Solutions and its partner companies directly to the senators who oversaw their government contracts. Mitchell spent 3 weeks verifying the evidence with forensic accountants, cybersecurity experts, and independent sources. When she was satisfied that the information was authentic and accurate, she prepared to publish what would become the biggest defense contractor fraud story in decades. But Maria and Jessica weren't content to simply leak the information and hope for the best. They had learned from Maria's experience that powerful people could weather negative publicity if they controlled the narrative and limited the scope of investigations. This time they wanted to ensure that the evidence reached multiple destinations simultaneously, making it impossible to contain. Jessica had been working on what she called a digital dead man switch, an automated system that would release the evidence to multiple journalists, law enforcement agencies, and government oversight offices if their investigation was discovered and they were prevented from acting. She had also prepared copies of the evidence for international journalists and foreign intelligence agencies, reasoning that if the American political system was too corrupted to address the fraud, outside pressure might force action. The morning that Mitchell's story was scheduled to publish, Maria felt a mixture of terror and excitement that she had never experienced before. She knew that within hours her quiet life as an anonymous accountant would be over forever. The people she was exposing would know exactly who was responsible, and they would use every resource at their disposal to destroy her. But she also knew that this time would be different from her congressional testimony. Instead of standing alone before a panel of hostile senators, she would have the protection that came from public attention and media scrutiny. The evidence was now in the hands of professional journalists who understood how to verify and present it effectively. Mitchell's story, titled "The Pentagon's Phantom Billions: How Defense Contractors and Congressional Allies Looted the Military Budget," hit the Washington Post's website at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. By 7 a.m., it was the most read story on the site. By 8 a.m., every major news network was scrambling to catch up with their own coverage. The story was everything Maria and Jessica had hoped for. Mitchell had presented the evidence clearly and comprehensively, showing not just the mechanics of the fraud but also the human cost soldiers who had died because they didn't have the equipment they needed, while the money meant to protect them lined the pockets of contractors and politicians. But the real genius of their strategy became apparent within hours of publication. Rather than simply reporting on the fraud, Mitchell's story had prompted immediate action from multiple directions. The FBI announced that they were opening a criminal investigation based on evidence they had received from anonymous sources. The Pentagon's Inspector General revealed that they had already begun auditing defense contracts following similar tips. International allies began questioning their own contracts with the implicated companies. Most importantly, Senator Warren's office announced that they would be holding emergency hearings and had subpoenaed documents from all the companies mentioned in the story. This time, the senators involved in the fraud couldn't simply dismiss the allegations. They were facing scrutiny from their own colleagues and the full attention of the national media. By noon, the stock prices of Pinnacle Defense Solutions and its partner companies were in free fall. Their government contracts were being suspended pending investigation. The lawyers representing the companies were already reaching out to prosecutors to discuss plea agreements. Maria watched the coverage from Jessica's apartment, feeling a sense of vindication she had never experienced before. The same senators who had humiliated her just months earlier were now facing calls for their resignation from members of their own party. Richard Blackstone, who had threatened to destroy her career for speaking up, was being arrested at his home while news cameras rolled. The most satisfying moment came when Senator Whitman held a hastily arranged press conference to deny any wrongdoing. Standing behind a podium with sweat visible on his forehead despite the cool weather, he looked nothing like the confident, dismissive man who had lectured Maria about her lack of qualifications. When reporters asked him about the evidence showing payments from defense contractors to his family's consulting firm, he stumbled over his words and ended the conference after just 10 minutes. But the real measure of their success wasn't the immediate media coverage, it was the systematic dismantling of the fraud network that followed. Within days, the FBI had arrested dozens of executives from defense contracting companies. Federal prosecutors had frozen offshore accounts containing hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen funds. Congressional ethics committees had opened investigations into 8 senators and 12 House representatives. Jessica's technical expertise had been crucial in making the evidence impossible to dismiss or suppress. Unlike Maria's previous attempt to expose the fraud, this time the evidence was independently verified, widely distributed, and presented with such technical precision that even the most corrupt officials couldn't claim it was based on misunderstandings or personal grievances. The anonymous nature of their approach had also protected them from immediate retaliation. While Maria's identity was eventually revealed through investigative reporting, by that time the fraud network was already collapsing, and its leaders were more concerned with avoiding prison than seeking revenge against whistleblowers. 3 days after the story broke, Maria received a call that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. Senator Warren's office was inviting her to testify before the emergency oversight hearing, not as a confused employee making unfounded allegations, but as a key witness whose courage had exposed one of the largest government fraud schemes in history. As Maria hung up the phone, she realized that everything had changed. The quiet accountant who had been dismissed and humiliated for trying to do the right thing was now being hailed as a hero who had saved taxpayers billions of dollars and potentially countless military lives. But perhaps most importantly, she had proven that even the most powerful people in Washington could be held accountable when the right evidence was presented in the right way. The system hadn't failed her after all. She had simply needed to learn how to use it more effectively. Looking at Jessica, who was monitoring news coverage on multiple laptops while fielding calls from journalists and law enforcement agencies, Maria marveled at how much their partnership had accomplished. 2 women who had felt powerless against a corrupt system had found a way to bring it down from within. The flash drive that had started as Jessica's simple compilation of evidence had become the weapon that toppled an empire built on stolen money and protected by political corruption. And Maria Santos, the humble accountant who had once been too intimidated to speak loudly enough into a microphone, was about to become the most important witness in the biggest government corruption trial of the decade. 6 months after the story broke, Maria found herself standing in the same Senate hearing room where she had been humiliated, but this time everything was different. The room was packed with journalists, federal prosecutors, military families, and government officials. Television cameras from major networks captured every moment of what had become the most watched congressional hearing in years. The table where Maria had once sat alone and dismissed now accommodated a panel of expert witnesses that included forensic accountants, FBI investigators, Pentagon auditors, and military procurement specialists. Maria was introduced not as a confused accountant making wild accusations, but as the whistleblower, whose courage and persistence exposed the largest defense contractor fraud in American history. Senator Whitman was nowhere to be seen. He had resigned in disgrace 2 months earlier after federal prosecutors filed corruption charges against him. Senator Fleming had also stepped down, and Morrison was facing a recall election in his home state. The committee was now chaired by Senator Warren, whose investigation had ultimately led to criminal prosecutions and the recovery of over $3 billion in stolen funds. As Maria took her oath to tell the truth, she thought about how different this moment felt from her previous testimony. Then she had been a frightened woman trying to make powerful people listen to uncomfortable truths. Now she was a respected expert whose analysis had been validated by teams of federal investigators and forensic specialists. Ms. Santos, Senator Warren began, your initial discovery of irregularities in Pinnacle Defense Solutions accounting led to an investigation that has uncovered fraud involving 43 companies, 16 members of Congress, and over $4 billion in taxpayer money. Can you tell us what motivated you to continue pursuing this matter, even after facing retaliation and public humiliation? Maria looked out at the crowded room and thought about all the people whose lives had been affected by the fraud she had helped expose. Military families whose loved ones had died because of faulty equipment, taxpayers whose money had been stolen to fund luxury lifestyles for corrupt officials, honest defense contractors who had been undercut by companies willing to cheat the system. Senator Warren, Maria said, her voice strong and clear, I kept going because I realized that being humiliated in a hearing room was nothing compared to what our soldiers face when they don't have the equipment they need to stay safe. Every dollar that was stolen from defense budgets was a dollar that didn't go toward protecting the people who serve our country. The hearing continued for 3 days, with witness after witness detailing the scope and impact of the fraud network that Maria and Jessica had exposed. Federal prosecutors presented evidence showing how the conspiracy had operated for over 8 years, stealing money through fake contracts while bribing officials to look the other way. Pentagon officials testified about the equipment shortfalls that had resulted from the diverted funds, including stories of soldiers who had been injured or killed because of substandard gear. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Jessica Chen, who explained how the sophisticated computer systems had been designed specifically to hide the fraud from oversight agencies. Her technical analysis showed that the conspiracy had required coordination between dozens of companies and government officials, making it one of the most complex white-collar crimes in American history. The results of the investigation were staggering. 47 people were ultimately convicted of federal crimes including fraud, bribery, and conspiracy charges. Prison sentences ranged from 5 to 25 years, with Richard Blackstone receiving the maximum penalty for his role as the conspiracy's primary organizer. The government recovered over $3.2 billion through asset seizures and plea agreements, money that was redirected to military equipment procurement and veteran health care programs. More importantly, the scandal led to comprehensive reforms in defense contractor oversight. New computer systems were implemented to track equipment from manufacture to delivery, making it impossible to hide the kind of phantom shipments that had been central to the fraud. Congressional ethics rules were strengthened, and new laws were passed protecting whistleblowers from retaliation. Maria herself became something of a celebrity in the world of government accountability. She was invited to speak at conferences about corporate fraud, testified before other congressional committees about the need for stronger oversight, and eventually started a consulting firm that helped other companies implement ethical accounting practices. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. 2 years after the scandal broke, Maria received a letter from a Marine sergeant serving in Afghanistan. He wrote that his unit had finally received the communications equipment they had been promised for years, and that the reliable gear had already saved lives during several combat operations. "I don't know if you'll ever see this," the sergeant had written, "but I wanted you to know that what you did matters out here. When we have equipment we can count on, we can focus on our mission instead of worrying about whether our radios will work when we need them. Thank you for making sure we got what we were supposed to get." Jessica had also found her calling in the aftermath of the investigation. Her technical skills and ethical compass made her invaluable to federal agencies working to prevent similar frauds. She eventually became the head of a new cybersecurity unit within the Pentagon's Inspector General's office, using her expertise to design systems that could detect financial irregularities before they grew into major scandals. The two women remained close friends, bonded by their shared experience of taking on a corrupt system and winning. They often reflected on how their partnership had been crucial to their success. Maria's financial expertise and institutional knowledge combined with Jessica's technical skills and strategic thinking had created something more powerful than either could have achieved alone. 3 years after that humiliating first hearing, Maria stood once again in the Capitol building. But this time she was there to receive the Government Accountability Office's Award for Distinguished Public Service. As she shook hands with lawmakers and accepted congratulations from federal investigators, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a quiet accountant who just wanted to do her job honestly. She had been dismissed, humiliated, and threatened by people who thought their power made them untouchable. But she had also discovered that individual courage, combined with the right allies and the right strategy, could bring down even the most entrenched corruption. The small flash drive that Jessica had created, containing millions of documents organized into an undeniable pattern of fraud, had become the weapon that toppled an empire built on stolen money and protected by political connections. But the real power hadn't been in the technology or even in the evidence itself. It had been in two women's refusal to accept that wrongdoing should be ignored simply because powerful people found it inconvenient to address. As Maria walked down the steps of the Capitol building after the ceremony, she passed the spot where she had stood 3 years earlier, feeling defeated and alone. Now she walked with confidence, knowing that she had proven something important about the nature of power in America, that it ultimately belongs to the people who are brave enough to demand accountability, even when the odds seem impossible. The empire of fraud and corruption that had seemed untouchable had fallen, brought down by the determination of a humble woman who refused to be humiliated into silence, and in its place a new system had emerged, one where oversight actually meant something, where whistleblowers were protected rather than punished, and where the people's money went to protect the people who served their country, rather than enriching those who exploited it.